Welcome to the fifth week of the Foundations of Economic Thought Open Online course presented by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. We're glad to have you with us. Today's session will last, as always, 90 minutes, beginning with a lecture of around 60 to 75, followed by a live Q&A lasting 50 to 30 minutes. Again, feel free to send in your questions at any point using the Zoom Q&A feature. We are pleased to welcome today Professor Harald Hagemann, a leading scholar in the history of economic thought and professor of economic theory at the University of Hohenheim. He has held visiting positions worldwide, served as president of the European Society for the History of Economic Thought, and is honorary chairman of the German Keynes Society. In today's lecture, Professor Harald Hagemann explored the legacy of John Maynard Keynes and the emergence of state-led economic policies. He traces how the general theory challenged classical economics, influenced successive macroeconomic schools, and remained central to the debates on unemployment, wage rigidity, and deflation. Through historical and analytical lens, Professor Hagemann will underscore the enduring relevance of Keynesian thought in confronting contemporary economic challenges. Please, Professor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, now it works. Okay, so welcome to all of you. I'm located in Stuttgart in Germany now, and I talk on John Maynard Keynes, who was born in 1883. And 1883 was a great year for a course like this one on great economists, because Keynes was born on the 5th of June. 4 months earlier, on the 8th of February, Joseph Schumpeter was born. And in between, on the 14th of March, Karl Marx died. So in 1983, at the centennial year, you had worldwide conferences on Marx, Keynes, and Schumpeter. And I'm sure that this will happen again in 8 years from now, in 2033, at the 150th anniversary. Keynes was born in Cambridge, where his father was an economist, too well known for his work on economic methodology, John Neville Keynes. And the mother, in the age of 70, in 1932, became the mayor of Cambridge. And she stayed in that position until 1939. So when the general theory by her son was published, she was the mayor of Cambridge. Now, Keynes originally studied mathematics and philosophy and took an early degree in 1905 and made his PhD in 1909 with the treatise on probability. He studied more or less in an informal way economics with Alfred Marshall, who was a good friend to his parents too. So more or less Marshall was his main teacher in economics. Keynes, for the first time, became known with his book on Indian currency and finance, but then there was a worldwide event when he dropped out of the British delegation at the Versailles conference after World War I in 1919 and wrote his pamphlet, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which immediately was translated into more than 10 languages and which became a great also economic success. In 1925, he married Lydia Lopukova, who was one of the 3 great Russian ballerinas who rocked Paris after World War I. Another one of the 3 was married by Pablo Picasso. She was the first wife. So there's a wonderful painting of Lydia Lopukova by Pablo Picasso also existing. Keynes originally was a monetary theorist, as you can see also from most of his books, like titles like A Tract on Monetary Reform or A Treatise on Money. But then why we discuss him today is basically due to the fact that in 1936, he wrote the book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And that's the reason why we discuss macroeconomic developments after the book was published and why Keynes for most people is important today. Now, if you look at the title of the book, almost every word is important. You have his interest in money, so monetary topics, but also employment, which became the main topic, particularly unemployment, in the Great Depression of the early 1930s. And it comes first. And with employment, interest, and money, you have also the interaction or transmission channels between monetary and real variables including. And another issue which is controversial until today is the question whether Keynes' theory is general or a specific one. According to his own understanding, it was a general theory. I will come back to this issue later. In 1940, he published a longer essay, How to Pay for the War, where he dealt with a problem that in war periods, independently whether you are living in democratic societies, in countries like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or fascist Italy, resources are shifted from producing consumption goods to producing military or investment goods. And this shortage of consumption goods in some periods either leads to rationing schemes and or inflation for the prices of these goods. And this Keynes wanted to avoid. And this article shows best that Keynes was not an inflationist, which sometimes is an accusation. This may hold for some vulgar Keynesians in economic theory or policy, but definitely not for Keynes himself. And it's interesting that even one of his earlier enemies like Hayek, who had written a rather negative review of a treatise on money, reacted very positively to How to Pay for the War. Now, at the end of his life, he died relatively early due to a heart attack. He was a leading British representative at Bretton Woods when in July 44, so in the months after D-Day, 44 members from 44 countries met in this place in New Hampshire, which led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And there, Keynes more or less lost in two important issues compared to the US delegation, which was led by Harry Dexter White, namely that he wanted the Bancor, but Bretton Woods system became a dollar standard. So the dollar is the central currency until the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s. And Keynes wanted originally that the pressure in the case of international disequilibria is on the surplus countries as well as on the deficit countries. But the rules of the Bretton Woods system put almost all the pressures on the deficit countries for the adjustment process. This is a Keynes' position in recent years was strongly supported and reactivated by Joseph Stiglitz in many publications. Now, in 2001, Emma Rothschild, the wife of Amartya Sen, wrote a wonderful book on economic sentiments on Adam Smith, Condorcet, and the Enlightenment, and put a lot of emphasis how the reception of Smith and Condorcet changed in the course of time due to political events like the French Revolution. And this is very good to be applied also in the case of Keynes' general theory, if you take as a relevant time unit a quarter of a century. So 25 years after the publication in 1961, almost everyone said, we are all Keynesians now. I think the first one was Alvin Hansen at Harvard, but even President Nixon or one of the most important monetary theorists, Milton Friedman, were making this statement. Even if you are reacting in a critical way, you are a Keynesian. And the heyday of Keynesian economic policies in the United States were in the 1960s, in the era of President Kennedy and President Johnson, when Keynesian positions in economic theory and policy were propagated by leading figures in the Council of Economic Advisors, as, for example, Walter Heller, who was the chairman for several years, and leading Keynesian scholars, some of them later got the Nobel Prize, as James Tobin. So James Tobin always was a leading American Keynesian, but it's interesting that a period later, it was exactly in 1977, Tobin wrote an article questioning how dead is Keynes. Of course, he stayed as a Keynesian, but the resonance ground for Keynesian economics and economic theory and policy has changed basically due to the stagflation theory phenomenon, namely the fact that you had a coexistence of stagnation and of inflation. And this led to a kind of fall in Keynesian economics, with the heyday probably in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president in the US and Maggie Thatcher British Prime Minister. Now again, political and economic events 25 years later changed all this when Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. It was a kind of breakthrough or beginning of the main financial crisis, which led to what economic historians now call the Great Recession. And I have also only taken 3 titles of books which became quite famous in this period. The Return of the Master. The Master is Keynes. The author Robert Skidelsky now is a member in the House of Lords for the Liberal Party, or close to the Liberal Party. And he wrote the definite biography on Keynes, 3 volumes of about 2,000 pages. So if you have a greater interest and a lot of time, I can strongly recommend the Skidelsky's biography on Keynes. And he wrote it even in the earlier summer house of Keynes, which he had bought before starting the biography in Tilton in Sussex. Another book written by Lance Taylor, who was at the New School in New York at the time, Maynard's Revenge, The Collapse of Free Market Macroeconomics. Or John Eatwell, who was professor in, or still is professor in Cambridge, now retired, also a member in the House of Lords now, together with an Australian, Murray Millgate. In '87, they were the editors of the New Palgrave, together with Peter Newman, The Fall and Rise of Keynesian Economics. And these titles very well reflect the change in the public view on Keynesian economic theories and policies. And in that period, and this in a certain sense was renewed when the COVID crisis in 2020 had a very strong negative impact on economics in almost all countries, that most countries in the world, despite the fact that there were hardly Keynesians in government, they were practicing expansionary fiscal policies to overcome the crisis. Now, the general theory definitely had a strong influence as inspirator and challenger in a positive or negative way of the development of various macroeconomic schools. And the topics on these slides easily could make a whole program for a whole semester. I guess that Professor Villaverde next Thursday will speak more on the more recent developments like new classical macroeconomics and new Keynesian macroeconomics. And I would talk on the earlier ones, but I have to skip over some of the topics due to a shortage of time. So let's start with the neoclassical synthesis. And before, I have here some quotations from a book which was written in the centennial year of Keynes' birth, 1983, by his closest associate, Richard Kahn, also professor in Cambridge for a longer time, published in '84, The Making of Keynes' General Theory, where Richard Kahn points out a fundamental change in Keynes' position from being originally a convinced follower of the quantity theory or of the causal determination of the price level by the money supply in a strict monetary reform. Then in 1930, in the 2 volumes of the treatise on money, he was giving up the quantity theory as the main innovation. But in the language of Axel and Hüfut, who wrote a famous article, The Wicksell Connection in '81, he still remained within the Wicksell connection, but he dropped out of this. And as Kahn emphasized, the complete liberation of the confusions of the quantity theory by a hardcore Keynesian like Kahn in the general theory, where a lot of emphasis now is not on price adjustment, but on quantity adjustment, employment level, output level. And due to the fact that Keynes more or less replaced the loanable fund theory of Wicksell by the liquidity preference theory, he dropped out of the so-called Wicksell connection. Now, some economists would claim that modern macroeconomics did not start with Keynes' general theory in 1936, but with Knut Wicksell's Interest and Prices, which in the German original had been published already in 1898. And interestingly, the English translation done by Richard Kahn was published in the very same year, 1936, when the general theory was published and Keynes dropped out of the Wicksell connection. And Keynes himself had initiated the English translation of Wicksell's book. Now, Wicksell is still an important topic, and for this you can only look at Michael Woodford's book from 2003, which is a major textbook, I think, for many advanced courses on monetary economics, which is called Interest and Prices, exactly and purposely chosen the same title as Wicksell had done in 1898. Now, Richard Kahn, in his Making of Keynes' General Theory, argues that for Keynes it was very important in the general theory to fight against the so-called two main pillars of classical theory. The first one, Say's law, and the quotations are all from the general theory, that supply creates its own demand. This is the language of Keynes. And if we have until today very controversial debates, particularly in economic policy, supply side policy against demand side policy, this antagonism very much had been started and created by Keynes himself and the way he drafted the general theory. The statement is in chapter 2, and in chapter 3, one of the most important chapters in the general theory, you have the title, The Principle of Effective Demand. And Say's law, according to Keynes, is equivalent to the proposition that there is no obstacle to full employment. This was important for him. Now, there's a lot of literature that Keynes was not very careful as a historian of economic thought. He was much better in economic policy than in history of economic thought, on Keynes' misquotations of Mill and things like that. And he had a different understanding, even from Karl Marx in Say's law, because for Marx, the labor market was not included in the understanding of Say's law at that time, when full employment was not an economic policy issue and not part of economic theory. The second issue emphasized by Kahn was Keynes was fighting against the quantity theory of money in the general theory. And this later then leads to topics like the Keynesian revolution and the monetarist counter-revolution. Now, I'm coming to the neoclassical synthesis, a term which had been created by Paul Samuelson in one of the earlier editions of his successful textbook on economics. Neoclassical synthesis referring to the fact that you should combine neoclassical economics on the micro level with Keynesian economics on the macro level. This is, in the simplified way, the understanding of the neoclassical synthesis. Now, on the right side here, the guy who is most important for starting this neoclassical synthesis is John Hicks, who was the first British Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1972, together with Kenneth Arrow. And Keynes wrote two early articles on the general theory. One was written at the request of Keynes himself. Now, Keynes never had been professor of economics. The successor of Alfred Marshall on the professorial chair in Cambridge was Arthur Cecil Pigou. Keynes was important because for more than 3 decades, he was the editor of the Economic Journal as the leading journal in Britain and the journal of the Royal Economic Society, as the bursar of Keynes College in Cambridge, and as a key advisor to various British governments. Now, as the editor of the Economic Journal, Keynes had invited Hicks to review the general theory. And the choice was, I think, quite clever, because Keynes, as the editor, could not take one of his close followers like Richard Kahn or Joan Robinson, and he didn't want a fierce critic or enemy like Hayek, who had written a negative review on the general theory, and later regretted, on the treatise on money, and later regretted that he had never written a review article on the general theory. But this was the first article, Mr. Keynes' Theory of Employment, which was published in the Economic Journal. The more important article, which had the influence, was Mr. Keynes and the Classics, where you have in the title already this antagonism between Keynes and the Classics. The Classics were more referring to Marshall and Pigou, the neoclassics in Cambridge, then the classics like Smith, Ricardo, Mill, or Marx. And Hicks presented this article, Mr. Keynes and the Classics, originally at the famous conference of the Econometric Society at Oxford in September 1936, where there were others like Harrod or Robertson and others who interpreted the general theory. But Hicks' interpretation became the famous one, and he sent it in time before the publication, because it was published then in Econometrica in spring 1937, to Keynes. And Keynes responded in a letter of 3 or 4 pages, which you find printed in volume 14 of the collected writings, which starts at the beginning with the statement by Keynes, "I found it very interesting and really have next to nothing to say by way of criticism." Now, this is an interesting wording, which led to many articles and interpretation later. Hardcore Keynesians like Joan Robinson or Richard Kahn always regretted that Keynes never opposed in a stronger way to Hicks' interpretation of the general theory. Hicks himself took it more or less as an approval by Keynes. But now you can also interpret this next to nothing. Next to nothing is not identical with nothing, a sophisticated British understatement. And you find 4 points in this letter by Keynes where you have a kind of distance, but a relatively moderate distance from some of the interpretations which were given by John Hicks. Now, Paul Davidson had very much put a lot of Paul Samuelson had put a lot of emphasis on the fact that there was a dilemma, because he rightly pointed out the poor didactics in which the general theory was written, which for the understanding of Keynes was addressed to his fellow colleagues and not to the general public. One needs a lot of earlier knowledge in economic theory to understand many passages. And Samuelson once wrote that you need a long reader's guide to the general theory, even much longer than the difficult Finnegan's Wake book by James Joyce. And particularly difficult is chapter 3 on the principle of effective demand. Now, Hicks was on the way to write his Value and Capital, where he started the modern neo-Varesian general equilibrium theory, which had a stronger influence than on Arrow, Samuelson, Debreu, and others, Frank Hahn, particularly more in the United States than in Europe in the early phase. And therefore, he created a model this famous ISLM model, where you have the simplest interaction between markets, in that case, only the goods market and the labor market, no, the goods market and the money market, in a system of interdependent markets. And he put it in three simple equations. First, for the classical model, you have here M equals K times Y. That is the Cambridge equation for monetary equilibrium, referring to Marshall and Pigou. Then the investment function dependent on the interest rate, and I equals S as the equilibrium condition, which also played a longer role in the history of Say's law. And in contrast to that, Higgs created his version of the general theory, consisting of the three fundamental equations where the investment function is the same, but the two other functions are different. Particularly, money demand depends not only on income, but also on the interest rate. Thereby, money demand depends not only on the transaction motive, but also on the speculation motive. In the simplest motive, you have only an easy choice between holding cash on the one side and buying government bonds, perpetual government bonds in the easiest mathematical case on the other side. Later on, more complex portfolio selection models were developed by Marshak, Tobin, Markowitz, and others. And the second point is that saving depends not on the interest rate, but on income. And according to Higgs, the greatest change or innovation of the general theory was the dependency of money demand on the interest rate. Thereby, the liquidity preference comes in. And here you have the simplest version of the Higgs-Hansen diagram. Alvin Hansen, as the leading propagandist of Keynesian economics, when he, after his move to Harvard in the mid-1930s, created this kind of diagram together with Higgs, where one controversial case is the so-called liquidity trap, where in a main crisis, and if you take the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the long-run interest rate, which is important for investment decisions at the leading financial center as London, was at about 0.75, so below 1%. So due to an expensive monetary policy, you have not a great potential anymore to have positive stimulations of real activities, particularly not in the time when the existing capacities are underutilized by 40, 50, or 60%, and the opportunity cost to hold money are extremely low, below 1%. So in this controversial liquidity trap, monetary policy would be rather impotent in the crisis, and fiscal policy comes in, and thereby the role of the government to fight against the depression or a great recession. This is a key point of Keynesian economics. But the problem then is, and this is controversial until today, is this part of a general theory or is it a special case? According to the understanding of Higgs and several other non-Keynesians, the general theory is a special case. As quotation from Higgs, the general theory of employment is the economics of depression. So valid, but only for exceptional situations like great recessions or Great Depression. Schumpeter had a similar view of the general theory, and many conservative neoclassical economists too. In Keynes' own view, it was a general theory, not special only for cases of great economic crises. Now, if you go further, the next important contribution in the development of the neoclassical synthesis came from Franco Modigliani and his 1944 econometrica paper on liquidity preference and the theory of interest and money, where he integrates the labor market into the ISLM model. The labor market was not explicitly integrated in Hicks' earlier writings. So we have now a system of three different major markets which are interdependent. Now, Modigliani's paper, long paper in Econometrica, is more or less identical, which he had submitted as his PhD thesis at the New School for Social Research in New York with the two supervisors, Jacob Marshak and Adolf Lowe. I have a copy of his PhD thesis, and there's interestingly one major difference, namely in Modigliani's PhD thesis, there's a chapter of 8 or 10 pages where he also discusses the question of flexibility of money wages, particularly downward flexibility of nominal or money wages, which Keynes discusses in chapter 19 of the general theory. But this chapter in Modigliani's thesis is not included in his Econometrica paper. I could not figure out whether he had to eliminate it in the refereeing process or whether he added it later to his New School PhD thesis. But it's an interesting case because in the overall interpretation, the fixed wage interpretation of Keynes more or less came in with Modigliani's Econometrica paper of 1944. Now let's discuss a few minutes on monetarism as a reaction to Keynes, and particularly the reaction to the dominance of Keynesian economics in the 1960s in the United States and elsewhere. Now, the language of the revolution or counter-revolution more or less came in due to Keynes himself. There's a famous letter Keynes already wrote in January 1935 to George Bernard Shaw when he was still in the process of writing his general theory, which was published 1 year later. And is this letter to George Bernard Shaw, Keynes writes that I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize the way the world thinks about economic problems. Not within a year, I suppose, but within a decade. So this is not a very modest claim, one can say. And it also points out, which also is a relevant point in Patinkin's later book in the late 1970s on anticipations of the general theory. There were many economists and economic policymakers who in the Great Depression wanted to start a kind of employment policy to reduce unemployment, but without giving, in most cases, a substantial theoretical basis for that kind of policy. And this is what Keynes intended with his general theory of employment, interest, and money, to give a theoretical basis for employment policies. Also for, let's say, government intervention in this. Now, on one of the earlier pages, when I had mentioned some of his major publications, you find his essays in economic persuasion, which for the first time were published, I think, in 1931, including important article that the end of laissez-faire or the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, which in the last years has been discussed more intensively also against the ecological problems we have in the world. In the collected writings edition in the 30 volumes, where it is volume number 9, they have also included how to pay for the war and other important papers. This is, if you want to look at shorter essays, important essays by Keynes, I strongly recommend this collected writings number 9, Essays in Persuasion. Now, so Keynes had this claim himself, not a very modest one, to revolutionize economic theory. And 10 years later, it became very popular with the book by Lawrence Klein. Now, Andrei Zworenchik will know better than me, but I guess Klein's 1944 MIT PhD thesis with Paul Samuelson as the relevance supervisor was the first PhD thesis which Samuelson supervised at MIT, published for the first time in 1947 with the title The Keynesian Revolution. So it was Keynes' original claim, but it became very popular with Lawrence Klein's book, The Keynesian Revolution. So Milton Friedman's intention definitely was to start and to create a monetarist counter-revolution to the Keynesian revolution. Interestingly, Friedman himself did not blame Keynes for being an inflationist. That were other minor people who did it, not Keynes, not Friedman. Friedman himself, in the 1950s and in the early 1960s, when Keynesian economics was still predominant in the United States, more or less felt like the lonely monetarist voice in the Keynesian desert. And he was quite desperate in that situation. Now, the change for the resonance ground of the ideas of Milton Friedman or Brunner, Meltzer, and other monetarists came with the increasing inflation rate in the 1960s. And one major cause of this increasing inflation rate was the escalating Vietnam War and the way it was financed, particularly in the second half of the 1960s, not with higher taxes, but with a greater public debt. And this basically was also one of the major reasons why the Bretton Woods system, where the dollar was the central currency, collapsed in the early 1970s. Now, the breakthrough of Friedman's monetarist ideas came when in December 1967, he gave the presidential address to the American Economic Association in New York on the role of monetary policy. One of the most influential articles in economics, which rather quickly was translated into many foreign languages. So there was a change of idea, the breakthrough. And one article which is still highly recommendable to read is a paper by Harry Johnson, published in the American Economic Review in 1971, on the Keynesian revolution and the monetarist counter-revolution. Harry Johnson was a Canadian who was for a long time professor at the London School of Economics and at the University of Chicago. He always was flying over the Northern Atlantic from London to Chicago. Originally, he was close to Keynesian ideas, but he was never accepted by the guardians of the Holy Grail in Cambridge, John Robinson and Richard Kahn, and he became more an anti-Keynesian in that period. But he became more or less a monetarist, but he knew Keynesian economics as well as monetary theory, monetarist positions very well, and it's still a highly recommendable, non-technical paper, but written by Harry Johnson in 1971. Now, Friedman, in his role of monetary policy, created the term of the natural rate of unemployment. And you find many references in Friedman's article to Knut Wicksell, and he explicitly coined the term natural rate of unemployment in reference to Wicksell's term of the natural rate of interest. Now you have a starting point for many modern developments. Natural rate of unemployment became the NAIRU, the non-acceleration inflation rate of unemployment. The natural rate of interest plays an important role in the Taylor rule, and so on. So, but the term came up with Friedman's article, and originally Friedman had more or less adaptive expectations, and therefore a kind of difference between the short run and the long run Phillips curve. Now, Phillips was an economist at the London School of Economics, originally from New Zealand, who in 1958 wrote a paper on the history of the British economy over almost 100 years, where he had the unemployment rate on the one axis and the increase of the nominal wage rate on the other axis. Now, with the paper 2 years later by Samuelson and Solo, the modified Phillips curve came in, where you had the inflation rate pi here in the diagram on the vertical axis. If you consider labor productivity, there's a clear relationship between the inflation rate and the increase in nominal wages. Now you have here a vertical Phillips curve in the long run at the unemployment level U star. So 5 or 6% for a long time in the US, maybe now 4% or so. These Phillips curves controversy still go on in 2025, whether there's a decline or whether it's still valid. I can only indicate here that with Friedman and his adaptive adaptations, you could reduce unemployment, but only temporarily in the short run at the expense of a higher inflation rate. If you go from A to B, but in the long run, the inflation rate will go up and up from A to C to E. But for Friedman, adaptive expectations and also, let's say, money illusion plays a role. Now, I would say no one is so stupid. Most workers are not so stupid that they have a money illusion. They would always count, particularly when you have inflation rates like 8 or 10% in many countries in the COVID period or in the stagflation period in the 1970s. It would be interesting what the increase in real wages and not in money wages is, but you may not have the bargaining power to influence the price increases during the time when the wage contract is existing. Now, it was not only Friedman who criticized this modified inflation rate and this Phillips curve interpretation. Normally, the Phillips curve in the original and in the modified way by Samuelson and Solo is considered more a neoclassical Keynesian instrument. Besides Friedman, it was also Ed Phelps, who I think in this relevant period, when he wrote the 2 articles in 1967 and 1968, was professor at UPenn between 66 and 71. So basically products from Philadelphia, for which Phelps, more than 30 years later than Friedman, got the Nobel Prize in Economics, I think in 2006, if I remember correctly. And then you have the transfer in that period also to rational expectations, to Lucas, where the Phillips curve is vertical not only in the long run, but also in the short run. So this is one of the developments which, as a kind of reaction to the dominance of Keynesian economics, came up. At the other end of the scale, you have Keynesian fundamentalism, where representatives were, of course, Richard Kahn and John Robinson in Cambridge, but in the US, you had Sidney Weintraub and Paul Davidson, who together founded the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics in the 1970s. Among others, in England, Victoria Chick, for example, who was professor originally from Berkeley, but for a long time professor at University College in London, who was in that line. And these Keynesians who emphasize Keynes' original and are rather critical of the ISLM diagram and the neoclassical synthesis, they put emphasis on the 3 chapters of the general theory, 3 principles of effective demand, 12, the state of long-term expectations, and 17, the essential properties of interest and money. Now, I cannot go into all the details. Important topics for them are uncertainty and expectations. Now, concerning uncertainty, Keynes wrote his PhD thesis on probability. Now, neoclassical economists normally talk of risk, where you can calculate probabilities. For example, if you have a tumbling dice, whether 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 will come, you have a priori certain probabilities. Uncertainty, particular so-called fundamental uncertainty, you cannot calculate exactly in a mathematical way probabilities. The critic very often is that if you overstate uncertainty, you may end up in analytical nihilism. So uncertainty, for example, was the topic, for example, of the explosion of a nuclear power station where probabilities very low ones were calculated, but it was more a case of uncertainty, I would say. So uncertainty is a major topic, and expectations. Keynes himself distinguishes between short-term expectations and long-term expectations, both related to the decisive actors, the entrepreneurs in capitalist economies. Short-term expectations are related to production decisions, where you have to make a decision in the Higgsian week on Monday morning how great the quantity of certain goods you are producing with the existing capital stock, and to relate it to expected revenues. Long-term expectations are important for investment decisions, depending on the expected lifetime of the investment. So the time horizon is longer for construction investment than for investment in new machinery, particularly if you have a lot of modern technology in the machinery, then you have a time horizon of 3 or maybe a maximum of 5 years, and not of 20, 30, or 50 years as with buildings. So you have to calculate the expected proceeds over a relatively long time horizons. And here Keynes has an important distinction between normal times and abnormal times. In normal times, these long-term expectations are rather stable. In abnormal times, they can change very quickly. Normally in the literature, you have reference to negative shocks, like financial shocks in autumn 29 when the Great Depression started, or September 2008 with the crash of Lehman Brothers, which was the kind of beginning of the major financial crisis and the Great Recession. Or in a positive way, for example, in Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, in November 89, led to an immediate increase in interest rates for about 3% within some months, from lower than 6% to 9%. But investment increased enormously, doubled within 2 years, despite the increase in interest rates, because there was a shift of the investment curve to the outside because of the much more optimistic expectations of the entrepreneurs who expected a much greater domestic market and also now more exports to Eastern Europe. So the way the investment curve is existing depends very much on the long-term expectations of the entrepreneurs who make the investment decisions. And in turbulent times, they can change very quickly, like also in the COVID case. Now, Keynesian fundamentalists, and this is my last point to them, distinguish the employment market from the labor market. And this may be illustrated by 2 diagrams. The first one, which is very famous for fundamentalist Keynesians, is this one. The content is exactly genuine for chapter 3, the principle of effective demand in Keynes, but you will not find this diagram in Keynes. It first comes up with Sidney Weintraub, then in the book by Davidson and Smolensky, and then on the best level, I would say, in the book by Victoria Chick from 83 on macroeconomics after Keynes, where she discusses also that this curve is very special depending on the money. It's always for a given money wage, and it differs with a change in the money or nominal wage. But the important point is that both curves relate to the expectations of entrepreneurs, and not like in a partial labor market analysis of the classical type, where the labor supply curve is a curve on the side of the households, and the labor demand curve, a curve from the point of view of the entrepreneurs. Here, both the labor aggregate demand curve Z as well as the aggregate demand curve, cost curve Z refer to the expectations of the entrepreneurs as the decisive actors. So employment is determined on the employment market, not on the partial labor market. This is an important point. And one controversial in this case always is also related to the fact, no one doubts that it is important to have a system of interdependent markets, whether they are on the same level or whether you have a hierarchy of markets. Now, I have to skip over this page where you have a lot of development in the 1960s and 70s in macroeconomic. Robert Klauer in 33 wrote an article first published in a German translation in 63 and in the English original only in 65 in a conference volume of the International Economic Association, where he was referring to the dual decision hypothesis and a distinction between effective and notional supply and demand variables. Notional variables or hypothetical variables are only valid and becoming effective if the Walrasian equilibrium is realized. But different from the Walrasian auctioneer, in real markets, transactions have to take place at given prices or wages which are not market clearing, which is also called trading at false prices. False means non-market clearing prices. So trading on the labor market, on the goods market, before the Walrasian auctioneer had founded the equilibrium level. And this leads to a kind of quantity rationing. And what is interesting in this case is that you have spillover and feedback effects. And in the literature, very important, if you look at the development in macroeconomics, is the second edition of Don Patinkin's Money, Interest, and Prices from 1965, particularly the new chapter 13, where he makes the classical distinction between classical unemployment and Keynesian unemployment. Keynesian unemployment, no, classical unemployment is the consequence of a too high wage level. If you take a partial analysis of the labor market with the labor supply curve LS and the labor demand curve LD, both as functions of the real wage, which is normally the case in neoclassical economics, then the equilibrium real wage would be W divided by P star, and the employment level associated with it, the full employment level or employment equilibrium at L star. Now, what you have when there are so-called spillover and feedback effects, if you have a situation, you can discuss it from the viewpoint of households as well as firms. Let's start with the households. If you have unemployment, then the whole labor supply is not sold. So the wage income of the private households is lower than at full employment. This has negative spillover effects on their demand as consumers on the good markets. Therefore, on the good markets, in such a situation of high unemployment, the firms cannot sell all the goods they had produced, and they will reduce, as a consequence of this, their labor supply. This would be feedback effects on the goods market. You can also start on the goods market, where firms are rationed. And this can be shown in a diagram which originally Patinkin has invented. And interestingly, there's a an article which for several years had a greater impact by Robert Barrow and Herschel Grossman in the American Economic Journal of 1978, a general disequilibrium model of income and employment. And 5 years later, they published a book together, Money, Employment, and Inflation, in 1976. But shortly afterwards, Robert Barrow distanced himself from that position with the argument that it would give a too strong rationale for government intervention in crisis periods. And this he didn't want to support with his theoretical positions. Now, what Patinkin had drafted already in 1976 was here that normally, if you have Keynesian unemployment, if, for example, there's a distinction between labor supply, which is higher than labor demand, then the wage level would be too high. So you have to reduce the real wage until you have reached the equilibrium level of the real wage. But Patinkin argues this part of the labor demand curve of the firms in certain situations will not become relevant. There might be a vertical necto down here at the level 0 if there is excess supply of goods. And this supply of goods, excess supply of goods, can have the reason on the financial markets. Like, for example, in 2008, 2009, where the disequilibrium from the financial market spills over to the goods market and then to the labor market. Or it can even have a major cause outside economics, as with the COVID crisis in 2020, 2021, which had a negative impact on output and employment, and therefore led to unemployment, higher unemployment in many countries, in most countries of the world. And the decisive reason for that was not a too high wage level, which could be an independent reason, of course, leading to classical unemployment, but not to Keynesian unemployment in this case. Now, in Europe, you had a very influential book by Malenvaux, a French economist, leading French economist, on the theory of unemployment reconsidered, which in the review, Robert Solow called the local maximum of all theories on disequilibrium equilibria, because Malenvaux was a Varasian, and you had here non-Varasian equilibria, because you were outside the case where, according to Klauer, Walras law was valid. Now let me conclude with some arguments on controversy, which is a kind of evergreen controversy in economic policy as well as in the discussion of Keynesian economics. Is wage rigidity important for Keynes and for the general theory? Now, if you read carefully the general theory, then you'll find in the version which is now the one relevant for quotation from 1971, volume 7 of his collected writings, edited by the Royal Economic Society. Then in chapter 3, rather at the beginning, Keynes makes a preliminary assumption, a preliminary working hypothesis, but explicitly says that this simplification, which we shall dispense later, is introduced solely to facilitate the exposition. The essential character of the argument is precisely the same whether or not money wages are liable to change. Now, this preliminary working hypothesis holds for about 230 pages until chapter 19. The reason is that he first discusses the labor market, then the goods market, then the financial markets, and it's a complex system of interdependent markets where you have to put also the labor market into the general context, the general dependencies. There's an interdependency of the labor market with the good and the money market, and it's not so easy to discuss all these interdependencies in the normal way. Nevertheless, the assumption of wage rigidity, starting with the publication of Modigliani papers, became a widespread view on Keynes. And I have here a quotation from Haberler, where he explicitly refers to this in 1962, that the assumption of wage rigidity, if it's not made, the Keynesian system collapses or breaks down. No, this is not true. And I have here a statement from an economist, a relatively conservative economist, one of the leading figures in the monetarist counter-revolution, Alan Meltzer, who wrote a long article in the Journal of Economic Literature on a new interpretation of Keynes, and he made a book out of it in 1988. This quotation is from the book, where he explicitly says, wage rigidity, if accepted as the main message, deprives the general theory of its novel or revolutionary aspect. This is a true statement by a monetarist who had understood the general theory in this point. But there's also an empirical side to this argument, and Keynes put emphasis on the empirical fact that in the United Kingdom, in contrast to many other countries, also in the Great Depression, money wages have remained relatively stable. This is an empirical view. But there's a problem which came with the development in Britain and also a theoretical discussion. And Keynes is very clear in chapter 19 that a downward flexibility of wages would not work and lead to full employment in most cases. And this is explained in chapter 19 of the general theory. But the problem with this chapter is it consists of verbal arguments. The verbal arguments are partly made or mainly made in a dynamic way, referring to dynamic processes, whereas a lot of the debate thereafter, Keynes effect, Pigou effect, is referring to comparative statics. So give me 5 minutes and I'm finished this. There's a huge difference between a falling price level in a dynamic process and a lower price level in comparative statics. Stephen Markland from Harvard published a book 4 years ago by Harvard University Press, Raising Keynes, a general theory for the 21st century. 900 pages, complex mathematical arguments partly, where he tries to put Keynes' position, particularly in chapter 19, in a more dynamic interpretation, which was not done by Keynes. Now, in a verbal way, you have three main arguments wherefore, in a major crisis, downward flexibility of money wages would not work. One mentioned by Keynes are elastic price expectations. If you are in the year 1930-31, rather at the beginning of the Depression, where you have deflation, you do not know how in the next year or 2 years from now, 32, 33, prices will develop. Is there a further deflationary process, or are you at the bottom line of the deflation process? if you expect a further deflationary process, so elastic price expectations, with the exception of daily food, you would postpone the purchases into the future, new furnitures and so on. And you can observe in such situations that the different sectors in the economy are affected in a very different way. The second argument, also mentioned by Keynes, which Frank Hahn in the modern debate emphasized as the most important one, you can observe an increase in the real burden of debt. Even if you have a low nominal wage rate, interest rate of less than 1%, if the deflation is 8 to 10%, the real interest rate is about 10%. And this kills every new investment, particularly in situations where in a crisis, the existing capacity is heavily underutilized. And there's a third argument, which may be the most important one for newer debates. And this comes from James Tobin. The photo is from '62, when he was still a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Kennedy, where he wrote a book published in the year before he got the Nobel Prize in economics on asset accumulation and economic activity. And this book had a major impact. And he wrote the book a year after Paul Volcker, in August 1979, had become the chairman of the Fed. Volcker, who was a rather left-wing Democrat on the political side, but a hardcore monetarist. And his extremely restrictive monetary policy brought the inflation rate in the United States from a level of about 15, 16% when he came into office to 4% into 2 or 3 years. But this had the consequence that when there were mid-term or longer-term contracts with a nominal interest rate of 16 or 18%, the real interest rate now was above 10%. So you had an enormous increase in bankruptcies in industry, but also in agriculture and the Corn Belt, where you have expensive machinery and many bankruptcies. He was very important, effective in bringing the inflation rate down, but at the price of this disinflation policy, at the price of more bankruptcies and a recession. Tobin called it the Fisher effect, referring to a famous article still useful to read today, The Debt Deflation Theory of Great Depressions by Irving Fisher from 1933. Now, let me skip over it, or just mention one point. In 1930, Keynes wrote an article, The Question of High Wages. And he emphasized that if the wage level is too high, you always have to refer to the real wage level. You can only answer this question with regard to productivity, whether the wage level is adequate, too high or too low. And if it is too high, as it was the case in England after the decision of the new Tory government in 1925 to return to the gold standard. The problem was not so much the return to the gold standard, the problem was the return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of the pound to $4.86. And this led to an overvaluation of the pound. And therefore, British industry lost international competitiveness, not because the wage level was too high, but because the council was too expensive. And Keynes argued against it. Churchill, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer responsible for this decision to return to the gold standard, later in his autobiography said this was his greatest mistake in political office, that he did not listen to Mr. Keynes, but to his other advisors. Now, just a point at the end, if you want to read the literature, I think this book from 1920, originally by Random House, now available as ebook or a cheap paperback edition by Zachary Carter on money, democracy, and the life of John Maynard Keynes, is highly recommendable and was a success in the United States. There's also a wonderful YouTube video of Zachary Carter with Paul Krugman. You can easily find it if you Google it, almost 1 hour, a discussion between Zachary Carter and Paul Krugman on Keynes. And if you want to read on special topics, I do marketing now for our own book where I'm co-editor. Bob Diamond did his PhD with James Tobin at Yale. He's professor in Canada. In 2019, we edited the Elgar Companion to John Maynard Keynes, where you find 95 essays by leading economists on different issues regarded to Keynes' general theory, on economists and philosophers who influenced Keynes, Keynes' activities in economic policy, and the main economists who were positively or negatively reacting to Keynes. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Professor Harald. I'm going to Good. So we don't see you. Can you start? Okay, now we see you. Okay, great. So thank you, everybody. We are open for questions. We have a couple already, so let's start. So let's start with the broad one. How do you view the various interpretations of Keynes' work? Do you think it's important to remain faithful to his original intent, as many heterodox post-Keynesians argue, or is there value in adapting his ideas to new contexts?
His impact on post-Keynesians in the US?
No. Hey, how important is to remain faithful to Keynes' original intent?
Sorry, I had difficulties to understand the one word. His impact on...
No, how important is to remain faithful, to read Keynes faithfully?
Yeah. I think it's very important, but if you are not trained and you read the general theory from the beginning, normally one should read books from the beginning without a reader's guide, or use the phrase of Samuelson, it's very difficult to understand it. As well as you made the talk on Karl Marx. If you start Capital Volume 1, where he is most abstract and most Hegelian, it's very difficult to work through the first 100 pages to read Marx. So I would recommend to read a very good secondary source before reading the original. You have a much greater insight of Keynes when you're not starting with the general theory. You should have the general theory at hand, and my version is looking like like this, that it's more or less used too often, but it's very difficult to read it from the first to the last page in one course. So normally you look at certain chapters or for certain topics. It's, let's say, the didactic qualities of the book are not the best qualities of the book.
Ivan asks, Hayek once said in an interview that Keynes didn't know much economics beyond Marshallian economics. One of the reasons, according to him, was that Keynes didn't know any German. Is there any truth to Hayek's remark, or is it like a low blow?
80% true, not 100%. Keynes could read German when he was young. And he even reviewed some books which were published only in German. And he wrote reviews in English on books which were published in German. And he had a reading knowledge of German, at least so far that he could understand the importance of Wicksel's book. Also a book which he had read in parts was Knapp's State Theory of Money, which only in the 1920s was published in English. It was originally published in 1905. And there were other books which Keynes reviewed, particularly in the years before the First World War. So I think that he had lost some practice during the First World War and thereafter, when, due to political events, finally with the Nazi period, the German language lost importance. There is quotations on page 178 in the volume 1 of the treatise, the theoretical part of the treatise, where in the text he positively refers to some neo-Wexelians. He also refers to Mises and Hayek in this context, but particularly favorable to Hans Neisser, who became professor in Philadelphia in the 1930s, in 33, where he mentions in a footnote, but in German, I could only understand what I already knew before. And I think he was criticized for this statement, rightly criticized for that statement, that he could only understand what he already knew before. I think this is partly a wrong statement, also in the sense that he did understand more than he claims, but he was not so good in reading knowledge of German as, for example, John Hicks or later Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow, and some others. And with regard to Hayek, of course, Hayek reviewed the treatise on money, and thereafter there's this Hayek-Keynes Sraffa controversy, on which also Bruce Caldwell, who is the last speaker on Hayek, has written. And I think the heavy critique then of Hayek's Prices and Production, which came out a year later than Keynes' treatise in 31, based on Hayek's LSE lectures, Keynes asked Sraffa to review Hayek's book, and Sraffa more or less killed Hayek's book. It was the reason why Hayek was not inclined in 36 to review Keynes' general theory, which he later regretted. But one has to say, after Dunkirk, when Nazi Germany started to bomb London in summer 1940, the London School of Economics, which is located in the center of London, was shifted with regard to the lecturing and seminars to Cambridge. And between 1940 and 44, in that period, sometimes on Sunday afternoon or so, Keynes and Hayek did walks together and had not a personal friendship, but a much better relationship than before. And Hayek commented very positively on Keynes' How to Pay for the War, and Keynes reacted very positively on Hayek's Road to Serfdom in a quite astonishing way for most Keynesians today.
A question by Maximiliano. He says, is it true that Keynes opposed to some level saving, the idea that saving helps long-term economic growth?
Yeah. I did not fully answer the Marshallian question. Of course, Keynes was a trained Marshallian, but then in the 1920s, a critique of Marshall came up, leading to this monopolistic or imperfect competition by John Robinson, by Edward Chamberlain, and also Sraffa's book, article where he was critical. But firstly, he was a genuine Marshallian economist. This is quite true. And he also was Marshallian in the view that to be a good economist is not enough to be an outstanding mathematical economist or econometrician. You have also to know a lot on history, politics, philosophy. I think this was genuine Marshallian view. But in the general theory, he distanced himself partly also from Marshallian economics. So the general theory is not fully in the Marshallian tradition. And the term classical economist in Keynes is addressed to Marshall and even more to Marshall's successor in Cambridge, Pigou. Okay, now the other question.
The other question was, is it true that Keynes opposed saving as a way to...
It's also partly true. Of course, he is not fully critical of saving, but you have to understand there's one difference in the equation, that saving is not only dependent on the interest rate, but on income. You can discuss later, if you look at the modern development started by Friedman's permanent income hypothesis or Modigliani's life cycle hypothesis, that there might have been too much emphasis on the annual income in that year. But saving depends on income. The problem is that in the general theory, there's the emphasis more on the short run, how to overcome the Great Depression as quickly as possible. But the statement, I think the most the greatest quotation of Keynes is, "In the long run, we are all dead." You will not find in the general theory, but in the 1923 tract on money. The problem is more that although investment plays an enormous role in the general theory, the investment function, he abstracts more or less from the capacity effect of investment. And in the neoclassical idea, banks are mediators between what is safe on the one side to investment on the other side. In Keynes, there he is critical and differs from Hayek and Mises, who only consider the banks as the mediators who transfer savings into investment and give it to credit. Banks can give more credit than what is saved, which would, if it would induce, particularly in a situation where you have underutilized capacities at the starting point, it would increase to a higher income over time and thereby generate a higher saving with the increase of income. So you have a kind of ex post saving financing of investment activity. Schumpeter had very similar ideas where banks are giving credit to innovative investors, but the credit has to be spent for investment purposes, not for consumption purposes. This is quite clear.
Now we have a question by Lucas, which states, Keynes had an undeniable importance among many other things on the discussion about the fiscal multiplier. However, a significant part of mainstream economics nowadays point out to the crowding out effect and have put forward papers estimating the fiscal multiplier to be way smaller than previously thought. How do more traditional Keynesians and post-Keynesians perceive such evidence and propositions?
Oh, that's a lot. But let me take up just one word, crowding out. Crowding out normally is understood, as it was the case in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that if public debt is increasing enormously, this would cause an increase in the interest rate. And therefore, it makes finances of private investment activities more expensive and has a negative impact on private investment activities. But interestingly, there was an economist in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s who wrote many good articles in good journals, David Aschauer. And David Aschauer had, as the opposite to the crowding out hypothesis, a crowded in hypothesis, with the emphasis that you have to invest in core public infrastructure. At this time, he was referring to the transport system, to the energy system, to the communication system. If you have a much better public infrastructure, and you may include, let's say, the interstate highway program, which General Eisenhower, when he became president in the 1950s, was using at that time, then today, a cable network system, and so a modern communication system, a very good public infrastructure would have a positive impact on private investment activities. And a good public infrastructure also would include more spending for a better education, for spending in research and development, and for spending in the better school education, the better university system. And you may say, so modern term would be human capital. And the best decision of the United States after the Second World War in that sense was the GI Bill. Because in the US, you have enormous tuition fees. And those soldiers who came back from the war and wanted to study, they were exempted from tuition fees. And this tripled or quadrupled the number of students in the United States within a short period of years. So that you had an enormous increase in human capital, and this was very good for the growth process of the American economy in the decades thereafter.
So a question by Maximiliano, which I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. I would say, what was the justification of later Keynesians in reducing the impact of money on their models relevant to economic stability? Because there are some South American post-Keynesians today supporting high level of monetary emission regularly. So as if money did not matter.
are those who are referred to are those close to the modern monetary theories. Is this
Yeah,
intended?
maybe he's referring to that, yeah.
Yeah. I must say I'm not so much a supporter of the modern monetary theory. I know very well the main representative in Germany, and I know some at the Levy Institute. Rendell Wray, for example, is one of the leading American post-Keynesians who also develop into that direction. There are some very good ideas included, but there are also some sectarian elements, I would say, and a kind of downgrading of the inflationary dangers of too much spending in that way. But of course, it makes a great difference if you are already at the level of full employment and full capacity utilization, or whether you are in a situation like in the Great Depression or Great Recession, where you have enormous underutilization of capacity. In that sense, a monetary stimulus would induce also a stimulus of output and employment without greater inflationary dangers. But there's one interesting point, despite all the differences they had after the publication of the general theory between Schumpeter and Keynes. Next time you may include Schumpeter in your series too.
Yeah.
Keynes gave many lectures in the radio. And some years ago, there was a book published, Keynes on the Wire, where Keynes made the statement that the boom, not the bust, is the right time for austerity policy. And Schumpeter was very much along the same line. He was a fierce critic of the Brüning deflationary policy in the Great Depression in Germany between 1930 and 32 and in the years thereafter, which contributed to the Nazis' rise to power because unemployment raised to 6 million people in Germany in the time. But he said, you have to, let's say, a budget surplus. You should have in a boom situation when the tax income of the government is increasing a lot and spending all the taxes immediately would lead to higher inflation. And if you save some of the budget surplus in the situation, then you are in a much better situation when a crisis begins, particularly a Great Recession or Great Depression, without increasing the public debt immediately. You can refer to the excess money you have with a budget surplus in earlier, better economic years. I think this is basically a good idea. And it was in the 1930s that the Swedes developed the idea of a balanced budget over the cycle, not in every year, because if you have a balanced budget in a crisis or a balanced budget in a boom, it will aggravate the cyclical fluctuations. So to reduce the cyclical fluctuations, you have to create a budget surplus in a boom situation and a deficit in a crisis where you have less problems with an enormous public debt if you start from such a situation. Now, political economics in the way of Buchanan and so would argue in a way that the political process would work against saving too much in the budget surplus in a period of a boom.
So one final question is, what did Keynes think about the Soviet Union and socialism overall?
Yeah. I think only once in his life, already relatively early in the 1920s, he visited the Soviet Union. He hated the Soviet Union and he hated Marx, but he never was reading Marx carefully, I think. And Schumpeter, who was conservative. Keynes, I would say, was a liberal, but he was a social liberal at the other end of the political sphere than Hayek was. But Keynes was in favor of governmental intervention to save the democracy, to save the political system in a period when high unemployment contributed to the rise of communist or fascist party in greater parts of the world. And I think this political impact was quite important. And he saw the concrete situation when he visited the Soviet Union. Schumpeter was pretty conservative and more or less an adherent to the old Danube monarchy, which died in 1918. But he was conservative, but he appreciated Marx, particularly Marx's work on capital accumulation and technical progress. And he was criticizing Keynes heavily that Keynes was in favor of some cranks like Major Douglas or some others instead of appreciating Marx. So I think Keynes never read Marx carefully, to the disgust of John Robinson, for example, who wrote a book on Marxian economics. But he hated, for, I would say, good reasons, the Soviet Union, particularly in the Stalinist way.
Well, with that, I think we have come to a close. There are no any more questions. So thank you, Professor Hagemann. And thank you all the attendees. And we'll see you next Thursday when we will continue talking about the 20th century economics era.
Okay.
So
Thank you very much.
everybody.
Bye.